So let's change subjects a bit and talk about a major issue in the number of areas, and especially in Colorado, which is water and water rights. Just talked about non-potable water, so I think it makes sense. So when you're evaluating land, what are the key factors in determining if there's access to domestic water services?
Yeah, so I would go back to, well, first of all, if you're in a subdivision, it's probably going to be pretty clear who the water service provider is. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at a piece of undeveloped land, then I would go back again to that tax rolls. So who are the service providers? Is there a water district listed on those tax rolls? And that would cue you into who's going to be the water service provider.
So again, going back to the raw land versus the development and talking about wells, how can a buyer determine/verify if the property is eligible for a well and what types of wells might be available? Because I think people don't really understand this concept of wells.
Sure. So the first thing to know is that in Colorado, there's a Division of Water Resources, and they're the managers of wells in Colorado. They have a great website. If you have questions, visit the Division of Water Resources and you can read all about it. The state does not want you to drill a well if you have access to a domestic service provider. So if you don't have access to a domestic service provider and you have at least 35 acres of land, then you may be eligible for what's called a domestic well. The domestic well allows you to have up to 3 homes, an acre of garden, and livestock. Now keep in mind, there's other restrictions on these, like we talked about with zoning. So 3 houses doesn't mean you can have 3 houses. The well would just be eligible for 3 houses.
Yep.
If you have less than 35 acres, you're eligible for what's called a household use only well. And it's literally that, household use only. There's no garden, there's no livestock. It's just inside use only.
So what are the typical fees associated with water access?
Well, they vary greatly. And as you mentioned, in Colorado, water, we both know, is very expensive. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to want to understand those costs before you get into this piece of land. Again, in a subdivision, those costs are going to be pretty well known. If we're talking about an undeveloped piece of property, you're going to want to visit the water district, the water service provider for that piece of property. Most of them have good websites where you can access the information. But for example, one of the water service providers in our area right now, this is November of 2024, and those can change all the time. So as of recently, it was about $100,000 for a tap, and that includes the cash in lieu fee, and this is on a piece of property that's 1/3 of an acre or greater. Okay. So $73,500 for the cash in lieu fee. There's $23,000 in other meter fees, public improvement fees, distance fees. So you're about at $100,000.
Which is quite a bit. There's no question about it. So can you explain the differences? You just mentioned cash in lieu. Can you explain the differences between raw water, cash in lieu payments, and meter fees?
Mm-hmm. So the meter is literally the fee for the water meter. That's a hard cost that you pay for. Cash in lieu and raw water are the bulk of the payment. And so cash in lieu is literally cash instead of the raw water. A lot of the water service providers, they have a water portfolio, and so they have that raw water sitting in their water bank that they'll allow you to write a check for and then receive. Raw water means that if you have to dedicate raw water, that means that you're literally going out to the market and trying to find a share of the type of water that they accept. That can be extremely difficult. These are typically not traded in ones. It can be very expensive, but as we've talked about, cash in lieu isn't cheap either.
So how much water is a buyer typically allowed to use, and how do factors like livestock or gardening affect water needs?
Well, not to be a broken record, but it depends.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about undeveloped land, you're going to have an application process that you go through, and you're going to talk about the size of the home. You're going to talk about how many horses, cows, what livestock you're going to have on the property. And that's going to dictate how much water you need and how much you get. Again, using the water service provider that we just talked about, that $100,000 would get you about 220,000 gallons per year. Those are typically on a rate structure, so you have just paid the $100,000, but you're still paying every month for the use of that. And a lot of the service providers have put in tiered meter systems so that the more you use, the more you pay, to try to incentivize people to use less water.
Which makes sense. So talking about water is also a good kind of transition into sewer, because you often talk about water and sewer at the same time. So what are the main considerations when determining if a property is connected to a sanitary sewer system or if it requires a septic system?
This one can be trickier. I've talked a lot about looking at the tax rolls. Typically, the sewer provider is not on there. So this is where you're going to need somebody that understands that area and can help you navigate this. But if you're annexed into a city or a town, then you're likely going to have sanitary sewer service via them. If you're out in the county on an undeveloped piece of property, you're likely going to need to be on a septic system, and that's just an on-site sanitary sewer system. That's a very natural process that's handled on your property.
Yeah, I can tell you from a builder's perspective, those costs are vastly different as well. Whereas I know that around here in northern Colorado, you can get a tap for a sewer fee as cheap as $3,500, and then a septic system can run you $30,000 plus very quickly from that perspective. So along those lines, gas and gas services, are there notable pros and cons between gas and propane sources?
I think this is just a matter of personal preference. I have some clients who they won't look at a piece of property if it's on propane. But you've got other properties, that's the only option. We had a piece of property here in northern Colorado, and we were on propane. We wanted to tie into gas, contacted the gas provider, and the nearest line was a mile away. That was not cost effective for us to bring gas in. So it just depends. The other thing to keep in mind is that the propane and gas appliances are not interchangeable. And so maybe you buy a piece of property, it's on propane, you're eligible to tap into gas. You would have to change out some of those components within some appliances. So just to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, very good idea. So what should a buyer consider regarding access to the property for electricity, and especially concerning permits and spacing rules along those lines?
Sure. So electricity, there's in this area, there's only 2 service providers. Again, those are not on the tax rolls. So you're getting online and looking at, maybe Googling who are my service providers to find out who the electric provider is, or going to those websites and looking at their service maps. Hopefully that information has been put into the MLS for you and it's correct, so you don't have to figure that out. But if you're doing a new build on undeveloped piece of property, there can be a lot of lead time for electricity to be brought in, as I'm sure you know. So that's where you'll definitely want to make sure that you're talking to your builder and getting those pieces done early in the process.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think it's also interesting from an electrical perspective, understanding that, if you're in the subdivision land, it's super easy. You're really just drawing power from the lot line to the house. But then once you start to get into that raw land, you may have to draw power from some major area somewhere far, far away, just to the pedestal of the lot and then to the house.
That's right.
And so costs can jump up quite frequently there. I think one of the things, it seems like, as we kind of talk through all these utilities, is that as you think through pricing of the land itself, there's a lot that goes into it. A subdivided land may cost you the $500,000, but as we've kind of talked about, just getting the cheaper land, quote unquote, out in the raw land, out in the urban area or urban areas, may end up costing you more from a utility perspective. That's
right, and that's where we went back to the beginning of not all land is created equal. And so yes, understanding what is there, what am I getting for my $200,000 or $300,000 or $500,000, and what might I have to do to it in order to put a home on it.
Yeah, No, I think that's a common misconception that people think about it. They think about land from a perspective of buying a house. And so if you have one house that's cheaper than the other, and you can compare the bedrooms and bathrooms and that sort of stuff, but if apples are apples on that consideration, the land is wildly different.
That's right.
From that perspective. And I think there's a lot more risk that people don't understand from the raw land, and understanding that, though it's cheaper, there's a lot more cost that can actually go into that versus the subdivided land that can actually get you there.
That's right.
But it also goes down to lifestyle, and the subdivided land is usually smaller lots and much closer together, and raw land, like you said, 35 acres on a regular basis. So just depends on what people are looking for.